The mystery of the MV Manor Park. Let me please introduce Mr. Ian Biggar and Mr. Ken Baird.
Thank you, Martin. Hello, everyone. Goedemiddag allemaal, and it's nice to be here in Amsterdam to talk about one of those projects that didn't quite happen in the 1970s. There's been one or two over the years, but this is one where a ship definitely did exist because we did spend some time on it.
We did, in our youth, I might add.
Just to give you some background to the project, it really started in 1979 when Radio Del Mara was anchored off the coast of Holland. And there was a group of guys who came together to try and put an English service together from the ship, the Martina. There were two teams, one from Cambridge and one from Leicester. And they approached Gerard Van Dam, who was the guy behind Del Mara at the time, with the proposal, if you let us have some hours in the evening on the ship, then we can supply you with a 10 kilowatt transmitter. So Gerard seemed quite interested in that, and so the wheels were put in motion. From there, one of the guys who was involved in the group, a chap called Simon, went out to the Martina to do some engineering work. And there's actually quite a good tape exists of Simon on the ship with a tale of woe as to the conditions on board. And apologies if anybody was involved with Del Mara who's here today, but Simon does paint quite a picture. He went out to do some engineering work, but unfortunately Johan, who was the engineer, wouldn't let him near the transmitter. So he spent most of his time just walking around on deck, feeling sorry for himself, which was a pity, and living on peanut butter sandwiches.
7-Up, if I remember correctly, as well.
And 7-Up, yeah. So Simon spent the week on there, come back, and then another couple of guys went out to the Martina to try and get this together. The plan was to take the ship to a quiet port in Norfolk and install the 10 kilowatt transmitter, and then go back and start broadcasting on it. I think the wavelength that they had chosen was 1026 kilohertz for some reason. We have some homemade jingles, don't we, that that suggested that. So unfortunately there was some infighting in the Del Mara organisation at the time, and Gerard unfortunately left the team. Although the chap who took over, I think his name was Ad, was interested in continuing with the English project, but then he left, so all kind of fell apart. And the ship, as you probably know, ended up in port, I think after a couple of weeks of just one guy being on the ship and operating the whole thing. The scene was still sown though, and the two groups who were involved went their separate ways. The team who were based in Cambridge, led by a chap called Chris Cortez, who some of you might know. There was other people involved like Steve Collins, who'd been in The Voice of Peace. And there was a Leicester team that was headed up by Paul Graham, who later went on to join Caroline, and Alec Newman, I think, who did some time there as well. We aligned ourselves with the Cambridge team, and we heard about a ship that was available in a Scottish port. Through a contact that we had, a guy called Martin, who had some sort of dubious business contacts. So we headed up to this port in Scotland to have a look at this ship. But it turned out, unfortunately, to just be a naval supply boat. So it was far too small for our uses. But we did get to know the chap who was on board, the skipper, or whatever he was, I'm not quite sure, to be quite honest, who was, again, a
very grand name for
a shady character. But that sometimes that's the kind of people you want when you're trying to start an offshore radio station. So we kept in touch, and the guys from Cambridge came up and they looked at the ship and agreed it was far too small, but they did manage to pick up a transmitter that was a 1 kilowatt Swedish ex-maritime rig, which was taken down to Cambridge and converted to work up the top end of the M-band. So we had the transmitter, all we did now was a ship. So it all went kind of quiet for a few months. Then we got a call to say that this guy Brian, whom we met on the ship in Bowling, had appeared on another ship called the Manor Park, which was based in Sunderland. So that sounded good. So we needed to do some work in the ship because it was in dubious condition. So a couple of teams were put together, and we headed down to Sunderland round about July 1980.
July, yeah. Early August, perhaps.
Maybe August, yeah. To the Manor Park. Some work had been ongoing before that. The chap Simon I mentioned earlier, who'd spent some time on the Martina, was down there trying to do some engineering work. But we arrived there, I think you're right, around about August.
Very early August, yeah.
And what were your first impressions when you saw it?
Well, I thought, what have I got myself into, you know? We were only young laddies. I mean, I think I was 17 or something at the time. And we got to the place and thought, geez, when's the next train home, you know? But we got there expecting to sort of be involved in doing up the ship, painting at least. You know,
there was no paint.
There was no paint. There was like nothing. Yeah. So we spent a few days doing
just bits and pieces, trying to get lights working. There was, only some of the lights in the ship were working.
Ian got a couple of lights working. I think I held a screwdriver or something.
Right.
That was the sum of my offshore career, really.
And people were working. The engines weren't working too well either, unfortunately. So some work was trying to be sorted out there. So we got the impression at that stage that there wasn't a lot of money involved in the project. How they'd managed to agree with the guys who owned the ship to let it stay there for so long without any cost was quite mystifying as well. We don't really know to this day how that happened. But we went through. Then another team. We were there for about 2 weeks, maybe. I was there for about maybe 2 weeks. Then another team came up. People like Kevin Turner, who later went to Caroline. Kevin was involved in that, and Stuart Clark, who was a Caroline presenter, I think the 80s as well, if I remember rightly.
Yeah.
They come up and did the next shift. But it was obvious by around about October time, 1980, that money wasn't forthcoming, unfortunately. Also, the chap who was the skipper, we assume he was the skipper on the ship, had some real weird ideas, because I can remember him mulling over a chart of the Thames estuary one evening. He didn't have any glasses for some reason. He had a big magnifying glass like Sherlock Holmes, looking at this chart of the Thames estuary and arguing with Chris, who was one of the guys involved. He said to Chris, "We're going to anchor the ship here." And he said, "No, you can't do that." "Yeah, we can, we'll anchor it here. I'm the skipper, I see where it goes. You can't do that." So a row ensued until Chris pointed out that the reason he couldn't do it was because it was 3 miles within territorial waters, and it would be a bit foolhardy. So that kind of gives you an idea of the kind of guys we're dealing with, unfortunately.
We also had some crazy idea about getting into Scotland on FM from the Thames estuary as well. You know. One interesting point, Ian, about the whole project. It was like 1980, and at the time it was in complete secrecy. Nobody knew about it.
Yep, that's
Nobody.
Right. And
we were sworn, of course, to secrecy. And the story never leaked out until it was over, you know.
And the advantage was, as well, of course, Caroline had unfortunately sunk in the March 1980, so there was no ship out there. So had we been able to get the ship out there, it would have obviously filled a gap that was there at the time. In terms of finance, there was a guy that we are still in contact with.
Yeah.
He actually gets a mention in Paul Russling's Lid Off Laser book, a young Scotsman who came down to London with a promise of $1 million, but didn't have the bus fare to actually go and meet Paul, unfortunately. What had happened, apparently, and we still have difficulty getting the story out of this guy, is that he got an offer of $1 million from some sort of American venture bank. The only thing was that we had to come up with an amount to act as a surety against that, but unfortunately that amount wasn't there. I think they were looking for something in the region of £80,000, which was...
In actual fact, they didn't have £80, I don't think, never mind £80,000, you know.
But this guy Neil wanted to try and take this forward. After the Manor Park project had kind of fizzled out, he contacted Howard Rose and Paul Rustling, because he knew that those guys obviously had a bit more experience in offshore radio than we did, and they also had a little bit of money behind them. So Howard and Paul were looking at that time of reviving the Scan Radio project, which happened in the late 1970s. They were going to anchor a ship off Denmark, and I think because of the legal situation there, it all kind of fizzled out. But in the early 80s, they were going to start Scan Radio again. So this guy Neil, our contact with the money, went and met Paul and Howard with a view to start Scan Radio from the Manor Park. So Howard and Paul spent an amount of money to go to the States to meet these guys who were going to put up the cash, and they involved a lawyer as well, but it turned out, unfortunately, that it wasn't as clear cut as it might have seemed. So again, they didn't have the surety required to put up front. So unfortunately, the Scan Radio project, or the revival of it, fell through as well, just basically due to lack of funds. So by that time, the Manor Park languished in Sunderland for quite some time afterwards.
Yeah.
And the last I heard, it was actually in the Mediterranean doing some sort of boat carrying or whatever. So it is still around, but unfortunately it was never to be used as a radio ship. It was in quite good condition. I mean, if I remember, the cabins inside were okay.
A good coat of paint and a good clean would have
The problem was,
a lot, you know?
Yeah, I think there was problems with the hull. When Paul Rustling got a surveyor to have a look at the hull, he found it was actually twisted. So there was going to be some money required to correct that as well. So whether it would actually have been seaworthy to be an offshore radio ship is anybody's guess, and maybe it's just as well we went on it to find out. But that was a project. It did exist. The ship did exist. The project was going to be called Radio Ventura, which is something I don't think we knew at the time.
That's right. We never knew the name of anything.
That name came up later. The name that was mentioned to us was going to be Free Radio England, which is a bit Anarchy, I suppose. But that was the name that Chris Cortez has proposed for it. But later,
you might like to say that the slideshow didn't work today either. But
yeah, we had a few photos for you, unfortunately.
I think Martin's going to put some of the photographs on the website. There's a dozen or so images of the ship in Sunderland Harbour. And
you can look at Martin's website if you want to see just what the Manor Park looked like. It was very similar to the ship, the Magda Maria that Radio Paradise had out at sea for a couple of weeks in 1981. Very similar ship to that, similar dimensions. It was a good boat, but unfortunately it never made it out to sea to really test it out. The transmitter, the 1 kilowatt transmitter I mentioned earlier, that actually ended up in Peter Chicago's front room because when Caroline was raided in 1989, the transmitter was donated to Chicago to actually use out in the Ross Revenge, but it never actually made its way out there. Peter had it for quite some time, did some work on it. Then it went to a land-based pirate station called Radio Free London, which some of you may know. And the last it was seen was in Paul Graham's garage, I think, in Frinton, in several pieces. So it was never used, unfortunately, and is now lying there and has been taken for bits and pieces for other transmitters.
Robbed
for that. But that was the Manor Park story, short and sweet. There's not really much you can say about a station that never made it on air, but I hope it's filled some gaps. I know Martin does have the Manor Park on his website, and I was just to confirm that it did exist. It was a project, but unfortunately, as in a lot of cases, there was a lot of idealism and enthusiasm, but no money to follow it through. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
Well done. Yeah.